Well, mutual aid is simply the idea that any community has whatever it needs within it in order to meet its needs and to thrive. Oftentimes, we think of those needs, particularly as being financial needs or financial resources, and the idea that a community might have the financial resources within itself to meet its own basic needs. But we embrace a more broad understanding of mutual aid, in which resources aren't limited to just financial resources. But in our understanding at Two Rivers Church of mutual aid, we embrace the idea that all resources are equal. There's no hierarchy of power or hierarchy of resources in mutual aid. Instead, every resource is equal and flat. And so financial resources are just as important as relationships, are just as important as access to communities. Those resources might be things like institutional memory or community knowledge or the ability to engage in certain skills and talents. All of these, when you think of a full community-wide approach, are valid, valuable, and equal in mutual aid. Another idea of mutual aid that we embrace is the idea that those who have historically been on the margins of power and authority in mutual aid are made the center. And those who historically have been privileged and have had power in the center are then moved to the edges. A mutual aid approach means that we are always looking out to see who's on the edge and how we can incorporate them into the centers of power. And if we happen to be in the center, how we can move to the edges to make room for others. I first experienced the idea of mutual aid when I was talking with Jermaine several years ago. At a church that I served previously was an almost all-white church and one that had a great degree of financial stability within it. And we lived in a fairly prosperous part of town. And so she and I were working on a community event together, and I asked her, could our church come and offer a free holiday activity for her community there at the farm? The community where Fresh Future Farm is located is one that is vibrant and alive and historic. It is a community that is predominantly Black occupied and is also a low wealth community. And so I was very surprised when Jermaine immediately told us no, that we could not come in and offer a free community event in her community. She said that if we wanted a free holiday event, that that's something that we would create ourselves. And if we saw something that we might have a need for, that your community might be able to offer or provide, we would ask you, and then we would invite you into our space. You can't invite yourself into our space. That's not how it works. I really embraced and held on to that idea for so many years. And as we were starting Two Rivers Church as a new church in 2017 and 2018, it was an idea that we really wanted to embrace and embed deeply into the DNA of who we were as a congregation. How could we use this mutual aid approach of equity, of justice, of inclusion, and belonging in all that we do? Now, I need to tell you at the beginning that when we first started, we were a predominantly white group of people. And we knew that we wanted to embrace the ideals and the values of both anti-racism and full LGBTQ inclusion. And so we really looked to how could we integrate these concepts and ideas of mutual aid in all that we did. And we realized that mutual aid at its heart is based on relationships that are mutual, on relationships that are equitable, and on relationships that are built with a great degree of trust. And that meant that we had to be willing to enter into relationships of accountability, especially with those who we were seeking to be in partnership with. And so you need to know that we have made a great number of mistakes over the years. So much of what we have done has been trial and error. But we fully believe that especially as we are in this COVID era and looking to what life in the church might be post-COVID, that mutual aid offers an approach to do church differently. It offers us the opportunity to completely upend the status quo, to completely erase these hierarchies of power that we as the predominantly white church have occupied and lived into, and it creates an opportunity for us to make radical equality the way of life in the church. In Acts chapter 2, we know this was the heart of the early church. where everyone sold all that they had. They brought all that they had, received then into common, and they shared it, and no one had any need. This isn't just an ideal of a time gone by. This is the reality that we can embrace through mutual aid. So I want to share 3 ways that we have really integrated mutual aid into our entire life as a community. One is that we engage in solidarity with instead of mission to. Second is that we embrace the idea that we share the work. And then 3 is the idea that we bring multiple voices always to the table. In the church, for so long, we have embraced this idea of we engage in mission to other people. This is such an idea based in colonialism and in white supremacy for us in the white church. It's the idea that we have and we go and take to communities that have less than what we have. And often that's been based around financial resources. Just think about the ways we even talk about mission trips. We take mission trips to certain communities and to certain places as if we alone can decide how we dip in and out of communities and how we spend relational time and people's financial resources. In mutual aid, the approach is completely different. In mutual aid, because all partners are equal, all partners are valid, and all resources are shared, we engage in solidarity with others. And that solidarity always comes at the invitation of the communities that have historically been on the margins of power. So when we as a congregation were looking at how we could spend our financial resources, our relationships, our people skills and talents, and our time, we started by looking first to the edges. Who is not represented in Charleston? What communities have been disinvested from? What communities are having incredible work done in them that aren't getting the recognition or the support that they need? And so we decided to go out to the edges based on the relationships that we have spent years and years and years cultivating. And so we looked at what our values were around inclusion and justice and where we were invited to participate and work. And that's one of the ways that we were able to make this partnership with Fresh Future Farm. And over the time of the pandemic, from the very beginning of the first week of shutdown, we committed to giving 10% of all that we had straight to Fresh Future Farm so that their work would be able to go on uninterrupted or with as little disruption as possible. We committed to giving our people resources and our volunteer time and our effort because we were invited to do so. In a mutual aid approach, we engage in solidarity with partners, not in mission to any group of people. In mutual aid, we also have the idea that we share the work. Because all resources are viewed as equal, that means all work is also viewed as equal. And so that means that the work of preaching, the work of setting up the stage when we met in person, the work of keeping our financial books, the work of teaching and helping form the spiritual lives of our children is just as valid as the work of rest to our community members who have historically experienced incredible oppression and marginalization. It's just as important as the work of healing to our community members who suffer from chronic diseases. At Two Rivers Church, we don't do a lot of programs. Instead, we spend our time nurturing and developing relationships because that's where we see the work of Jesus being lived out in real and transformational ways. Not even primarily within our church community, but we work on nurturing relationships, whether those are relationships of rest, relationships of accountability, relationships of trust, relationships that involve physical work or financial work, primarily outside of our church community, because we know that that strengthens us as a body, and it also tells the world that all work is worthy of being shared. A third way that we engage in mutual aid is the idea that we share the voices that speak in our community. Our worship experience is not primarily one person talking and one person singing. Our worship experience is shared voices. We bring experts from our community in to have conversations with us. The work of preaching isn't shared by one person, not just me. It's shared by a team of people who we have, both ordained pastors and also people who have been given the gift of speaking and sharing God's prophetic word to us. It means that the ways that we communicate are full of people that represent the full cross-section of our community. It means that we're very careful in the music that we select to sing, in the version of the Bible that we choose to read, in the books that we use for our study and for book club, in the ways that we are able to use different prayer techniques and spiritual practices and disciplines. We look not just to one narrow type, but instead we look to what does the world have to offer to us? What does our community have to offer to us? What voices are being silenced? And how can we use our community to give a platform and a voice to those who have been ignored for far too long?